I'm not aware of any late items. Ms. Nogo?
Yes, so we do have some late items. So Mr. Wells sent in a document titled the Vancouver Island and Coastal Communities Climate Action Goals. So we would need a...
I don't know if I'm alone in this, but I can't hear you, Sky.
Can you hear me if I speak right into the phone?
Yes.
Okay. So Wally had a document to add titled the Vancouver Island and Coastal Communities Climate Action Goals. So we could add that to the agenda, but we need a motion as well. And then Elise has another document, and we don't have that document here, but we will send both of these out to the committee members after the meeting if they are added to the agenda.
Should Elise?
Tyler's chairing, but
Oh.
I can move adding the VICC Climate Leadership Plan draft goals on the agenda.
Should we ask Elise what the title is of her document?
Sure.
Elise, what's the title of the document you forwarded to us for the record?
The title of the document I forwarded to you for consideration is Implementing Food Security Indicators. Phase 2, Food Security Indicators Project by the Provincial Health Services Authority.
Thank you.
There's a seconder to add these to the agenda. Seconded by Lisa. I will admit I'm a little hesitant to add items to the agenda that actually haven't been distributed or fully. So I would actually seek staff guidance on this because it seems a little backwards. We would add something to the agenda later after we've already met. But
Can I move that we allow them to be circulated to us to look at after the meeting?
okay,
Yes.
Mover Ben, are you okay with that?
Sure.
Yep, that would be appropriate.
That's fine.
Lisa, the seconder, are you okay with that?
Yes.
Okay. And any discussion on that?
A quick word that thanks Wally for sending those out. The VICC Climate Leadership Plan, the outcome of the summit where a bunch of local leaders from up and down the island and coastal communities got together and put together a series of goals for 2030 that we'd like to see regional districts and municipalities achieve as a collective for the island. It's a visioning document, but this is the draft of it, and it still needs to be refined, but kind of gives an idea of sort of where folks are at in terms of aspirational goals.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Wally. Any further discussion? All those in favor? Any opposed? Seeing none, motion carries. Okay, just pulling these up here, but they are the minutes from the November 4th, 2020 meeting. Motion to adopt those.
Excuse me, Chair.
Lisa? Yes.
Before we move on, we just need to adopt the agenda as amended.
Okay, my apologies. We're looking to adopt the agenda as amended. Someone wish to move that?
So moved.
Thank you, Ben. Seconder? Thank you, Wally. All those in favor?
Thank you.
Perfect. And now the adoption of the November 4th, 2020 minutes.
So moved.
Anyone? Thank you, Ben. Is there a seconder? Thank you, Jerome. Any discussion, errors, or omissions? Seeing none, call the question. All those in favor? Thank you. Okay, moving on to reports. Not aware of any presentations or delegations, so the first item, sorry, my actual agenda is loading very slowly on the program that we have. So the first report is the 2021 Environmental Committee Work Plan. Mr. Lawrence, over to you.
Yes, thank you. As we do annually, this is a report where we do a bit of a high-level roadmap for a number of initiatives we'd like the committee to work with staff on. And I'll just briefly go through the table and then take any comments or questions you might have about the report itself. It's fairly straightforward, but I think a large portion of this, of course, is looking at the Reimagine Nanaimo process, continuing on with the work that we began last year. And obviously the first one, Donut Economics Environmental Indicators Report, which we'll have that discussion today about, but also more involvement obviously with the Climate Action Plan review and update and environmental policy development. There will be an opportunity to look at some of the environmental policy changes that we'll do as we kind of go through the Reimagine process, phase 2, phase 3, as I understand it, as we kind of go through the year. Solid waste education, there is certainly a climate component to this as well, but there's an opportunity to learn more about some of the solid waste education opportunities and initiatives that the Zero Waste Coordinator is initiating. And if there's any questions around that, I believe our Zero Waste Coordinator might be on the line, or Bill Sims, and we can have a bit of a discussion about that if that's something the committee would like to do. But we'd like to kind of have an opportunity to have a check-in around that issue and discuss that with the committee later in the year. Step code acceleration options. There's been a lot of movement on a number of fronts around step code implementation, but also looking at low carbon energy systems and how that can integrate with the step code. A lot of different communities in the province are looking at this now. And I think it's also timely for us looking at our building bylaw, where we're actually going to be meeting the building code requirements in 2022. So while we've been slightly ahead of the game up to this point, there'll come a point where we're basically at the standard by next year. So I want to start having a discussion around how we want to accelerate or up our energy step code requirements and take in some committee report around or input around that. That being for new construction, for existing retrofit opportunities for existing homes and buildings, there is a bit of discussion and some opportunity, I think, to work regionally with the regional district on a larger program for home energy retrofits. As you know, currently we do have some rebates. We are working with BC Hydro in the province to help promote, but there's certainly some shortfall on getting more awareness out there and having more local expertise on taking those rebate opportunities and accelerating the program overall. I think there's some opportunity to work with the regional district on this, and that's something I'd like to have a discussion about later on in the year as well with some of the regional district staff. My last point is at the end there. It's the Comprehensive Soils Bylaw. This is a fairly large work, and it has started, but then stopped for a number of reasons. Staff resource reasons primarily, but we'd like to kind of carry on with that work and finish it and go on to council. But it's basically a consolidation of a number of different bylaws. And it will have a significant impact on how our standards and requirements for around development in relation to erosion and sediment control. So those are the highlights in the table. So if anyone has comments or questions, happy to take that in.
Thanks, Rob. Is there any questions, Louise?
Within the soils bylaw, is there anything to promote the regeneration or expansion of topsoil within the region?
Can you clarify regeneration of soil? What were you thinking?
Oh, just I don't know if there's anything to promote more topsoil, since it's so important in agricultural processes.
Well, there is language in the draft we have now around retaining topsoil. That is an issue that can happen, that soil can be removed off-site, and obviously native soil to a given site has a lot of advantages as far as being a good medium for any kind of revegetation, and instead of bringing in clean topsoil, that might be a concern. So that might be what you're driving at, I think, and in which case, yeah, there is some language around that.
Yeah, there are questions or comments for Rob? on the work plan. Lisa?
I just see oh, never mind, it's okay, I see what I was looking for, it's all right, thanks.
No worries.
Wally?
Yeah, I'm not sure what this bylaw does with erosion, if it does it after the fact. Certainly my experience with erosion, it's much better handled in the development review and development permitting process to assure it doesn't occur. If this bylaw deals, if it does occur with cleaning it up, that's fine, but I'm not sure what the integration between the development permit and this bylaw is as far as erosion is concerned. It may not be the time to answer it, but I hope this isn't the only vehicle for erosion.
No, well, just the short answer, Wally, is there's a number of bylaws we have already, and they are working, but some are quite dated, and some of the language certainly can be updated, and the thought has been to integrate these various bylaws into one document. And that's really what this is about.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Any additional questions for Rob on this, or staff in general on this matter?
I got a question.
We do have a recommendation. Ben.
I just question, I'm kind of foreseeing our work plan, a major focus is going to be sort of on the reimagine process and the developing the indicators and really fleshing out sort of this framework.
And the climate plan. It's all integrated together into that.
And the climate plan, and then that framework and plan will set a basis of sort of these sub items within that of specific initiatives and programs of which are listed, the step code acceleration and soils bylaw and solid waste education, that we'll get an update of kind of what's being worked on currently in that realm, and some ideas and get for community input.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking a check-in on our policy development. I think that's something we could do at a later point when we're ready for that. Some of these items are actually implementation. This is past the point. We've already made those decisions, and now we're moving on to implementation. And that's what some of these items are speaking to.
Right.
But yeah, in the reimagine Nanaimo category, that's primarily most of the planning development, and all kind of tied together. And the Parks Master Plan and the water strategy. So all these documents.
Great.
Anything else? We do have one recommendation there, which is simply to adopt the work plan. That will obviously go through to council. Someone would like to move it? Or is that a question, Jerome? Question?
Yeah, a question. I'm wondering, can we wait on this till after the second presentation that we have today? Because it seems like major items of this work plan are related to the reimagine process and donuts, but we haven't had a discussion about that yet. So we're kind of voting, or we're recommending a work plan without having clearly explained what it is, and we may get to a point where we want to modify it.
Yeah, so at any point we can obviously modify the work plan, but I hear what you're saying. If I'm picking up, you're saying the concern might be that some of the items in the reimagine, the scope may exceed just the simple as they are sort of identified in the work plan.
Yeah, exactly.
One thing to add, I would simply say that the report today on indicators and the presentation are actually a response to an earlier council recommendation to specifically look at this issue with the committee. So, and that's being addressed now at this time. So I'm not sure if we can't do it this way and still achieve what you're looking for, Jerome.
Well, I mean, I feel like my concern is simply that the donut model was proposed, apparently was adopted by council, but we've never had a full sort of discussion about what that's actually going to look like and what's going to entail. So now we're looking at a work plan that now lists the donut, the key driver for this. There's been no real discussion around some of the nuts and bolts and what we're trying to achieve with it. So before we move on to a work plan defined by this new model, I think we need to have a discussion about what that's going to look like.
Right.
Jerome, I'll just highlight too that you may have already noticed, but the timeline for that process is January to October, so not just limited to this meeting, but
Okay, that's fine, so then if it's just a matter of essentially, you know, recommending that we address this at some point on an ongoing basis, that's fine.
Yes,
Great.
yes.
I just don't want that list to be the be-all, end-all of what is expected of that work plan.
Yes.
At any point, the committee too can recommend amendments to that work plan throughout the year to council.
Thank you.
So we do have the motion at the whim of the committee to move that or go a different direction here, but that's just essentially adopt the work plan.
So moved.
Moved by Ben, seconded by Jerome. Any discussion on that? I will call the question then. All those in favor? Any opposed? See any, Harvey? I can't see you, so I'm going to assume you are in favor unless you speak otherwise.
Yeah, I'm in favor.
And same with Darren there.
There it is.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes, Timmy.
Okay, good.
Okay, moving on to item 7B, which is the city portrait environmental indicators. We'll have a presentation here. Mr. Lawrence.
Just a quick request to the chair. I'm wondering if we could combine the presentation with the review of the attached report on the indicators, just to make it as an easier and a more free-flowing discussion about both items, since there's such a crossover between the two.
Absolutely, yes.
Right, perhaps we can pull the presentation in camera.
Of course. Right ahead.
All right, well, if that's the will of everybody, then perhaps proceed right to the presentation. And just because this is my first time at this committee, I'll introduce myself. My name is Karen Cronswell. I'm part of the community planning team. Can everybody hear me? All right.
And welcome, Karen.
Oh, thank you, Chair. So I am part of the community planning team and one of the members of staff involved in the integrated coordinated strategic plan review known as Reimagine Nanaimo. I'm so pleased to have the opportunity to join you today, give you a little bit more information about the city portraits process that we're engaged in right now, and more importantly, to hear your thoughts shared with Rob about the kind of indicators you'd like to see considered. So, I currently have the control. There we go. This is just a brief reminder of the council motion about adopting the donut economic model as the cohesive vision for all the city initiatives to be integrated into Reimagine Nanaimo. So that's really our mandate to move forward with developing this city portrait we're going to talk about now as the framework for the key city plans that are being considered under Reimagine Nanaimo, which, just to remind you, official community plan, Parks, Recreation and Culture Master Plan, the Climate Action Plan, of course, the Active Transportation Plan, then alongside that, the Water Supply Strategy and the Economic Development Strategy are being aligned with these. So I'm sure you've all been bombarded with this image. Just to remind you what this is. This is the original from the 2012 book by the same name, Donut Economics. And what it represents is, in the center is the social indicators. So the real goal for the Donut Economics framework is to bring every citizen out of a place of social depravity while respecting the environmental limits of the planet. And this is the basic sort of shape of the donut, but in other places, this has been adapted many times. It's called the beignet or the bagel, but basically it doesn't matter. It's all about this core idea. And in fact, in New Zealand, it's even been adapted so that the environment is at the center, as the foundation, and that the social indicators hug the outside as the boundary of the blanket. So many places have adapted this model, as Nanaimo is now in the midst of doing, but that is the fundamental principle. Everybody has enough, and the environment is not overtaxed. Now, originally in the model, this UN Sustainable Development Goals were sort of used as the basis. The 2012 book was really a global picture. It was thinking of things on a global scale, and this was also the background of the author, Kit Raworth, working with these goals. But certainly with the adaptation, other goals can be used for social indicators. And this represents the 9 life-supporting systems of the planet, of which just one is climate change. This is taken from the original book. And certainly you can see there are even domains where the limit of the planet is yet to be identified. So moving to the exciting part, they call it downscaling the donut. The city portrait is looking at the local social and ecological indicators, both, so let me start again. It's looking at social and environmental indicators of both the local and the global scale. And this really needs to be driven by the local context while bearing in mind the responsibility to the planet. So one of the quotes I heard from Ms. Radler, I was listening to a webinar she did where she said, how can the people thrive in the context of respecting global health, both in terms of the well-being of all people and the well-being of the planet? So thinking about thriving locally with global health. Now, Amsterdam, I think this picture represents Amsterdam as being the best celebrated and most advanced in terms of having adapted this model. Some of you may have seen an article in Time magazine this week talking about the actual implementation of this. Now, obviously, it's a very different context in Europe generally in terms of the powers that the city has and the scope of local government, but be that as it may, it really has done a very interesting job in adapting this model. And I also included this image just to show you that although it kind of gives this happy, hippie image of adaptation, there really was a lot of technical work done in Amsterdam with the Donut Economics Action Lab in terms of identifying their impact on the planet, and on the region, in fact, and on the planet in terms of local decision making, and from there walking it back to make their indicators and identify their targets. So although it is a very image sort of friendly project, it really has a lot of science backing it. So this is the four lenses I was just touching on earlier as far as the local social, local ecological, social, local global, and ecological global. So just to give an example, if you think about procurement, there's impacts of procurement, and I know many of you heard the great work that's being done at the city around sustainable procurement, social procurement. So there's impacts locally of a policy like that, and there's also impacts globally. So, and you can think about that across many domains of city activity. It has impacts on us locally when we buy locally, and it also has impacts on us when we buy, say, fair trade, or we buy things that are, carbon neutral, that sort of thing. So, am I going too fast? Is it the right pace?
No. Other just to underscore the fact is that in selecting the indicators with all that in mind, it's also seeing what we can afford to manage, and what's within our governance is what we can manage and what we're required to legislatively as well. But we can chat into that a little bit.
Absolutely, and I think that's why in downscaling the donut, there's been this huge emphasis on context. I'm from Yellowknife. And Yellowknife people understand that sea level rise is a big problem. It's not locally a big problem. The sea is very far away. So they would pick different indicators in terms of the health of the water system. Whereas for us, it might be a bigger deal. So that's kind of the emphasis, is thinking globally, but also focusing on what's locally relevant and, as you mentioned, like within our sphere of influence. So the great news for us, for you, for the community, is that we're already doing a lot of this type of work in terms of making policy progress in a variety of realms, and we're also well into the Reimagine Nanaimo process. So just to give you a sample of some of the current plans and indicators that we're working on or have worked on that have indicators we can consider as part of our work in developing the city portrait. This is just a short list. And I think, Rob, in your report, you've included a much more robust list.
It's a little bit longer, but it's just setting a stage and a floor for discussion. And I suspect as we gather more information and input from the committee, that will change as we kind of move forward with this. But it's as you can see, there's a number of different topic areas. If you look at the report, I'm going to jump into this. I've kind of looked at it from a kind of a lens of looking at air, water, and land kind of indicators, and looking at it from kind of a local and a global perspective. Again, these kind of have more of a local city lens. There are some kind of regional level indicators that the RDN is responsible for. Some of this information is in the wheelhouse of the province, but they provide that information freely, like air quality indicators, for example. And all of these, depending on what we want to focus and really kind of prioritize, could be used as an indicator as we kind of move forward with the process. And there's certainly room for discussion about what we choose in this, but looking at things that we kind of focus, that we can control and manage directly, and partly because of our governance structure, and what we can do under the Local Government Act and the Community Charter, but also looking at what we can do to impact or influence the community. I think you mentioned the sustainable purchasing policy is a good example of that. Not just about what we choose to buy, but how we influence local businesses. I think that has some interest as well, and it would be interesting to kind of monitor that even as how we kind of influence and create change in the community as well. Anyway, these are ideas right now, there needs to be much more discussion to kind of narrow that list and really kind of tie it into how we kind of move forward in the next phase of Reimagine when we're looking at the scenarios. Anyway, back to you.
Oh, thanks, Rob. So I've just included a couple examples of current reports and summary indicators that are done. This one's from the Regional District of Nanaimo. We contribute heavily to it as the City of Nanaimo. We make up a big part of the Regional District. This next one is from the RGS from the Capital Regional District. You can see people here have different styles of showing things. This is an example of another plan I've been working on. I saw Councillor Bonner was here earlier. This is the Health and Housing Action Plan, which Council hasn't endorsed yet. We're still working on finalizing it. We're hoping to bring it in March. But it too has many potential indicators for the social realm. Now, some of these, again, as Rob mentioned, we want to focus perhaps on things that we might have the most leverage in changing and moving the needle on, but there's also things that are very important to us to monitor. So that will be a point of discussion, certainly, as we develop the city portrait. We also don't want to choose an overwhelming number of indicators where inevitably we'll stop tracking perhaps some of the ones we really want to pay attention to.
And or a costly list as well. That's very expensive to try and maintain and update, obviously.
So this Donut Economics Action Lab that I mentioned, DEAL, has published a great deal of free resources, open source resources, which we really appreciate. This is a decision sort of flow chart on terms of how to think about making a new indicator. And you can see there, I'll just give you a second to take a look at it. Some of you may have already seen it from the resources. I believe the chair has passed this along to some of you in the past. But the last question is a more current estimate needed given the COVID-19 context? And this whole question around how COVID is changing trends and the ability to accurately monitor at this time, it'll be really interesting to see how that affects. I know that for Amsterdam, they really thought of COVID as the Great Reset, and they positioned this implementation of the Donut Economics Framework as their response almost to COVID and trying to rebuild their city in a different way. So I thought that was interesting. So in terms of next steps, we've finished phase 1 engagement for Reimagine Nanaimo, and the summary of engagement is scheduled to go to the Governance and Priorities Committee on February 8th. So that will be a chance for us to start talking publicly about the findings of that and pulling from that. Obviously, the staff are reviewing that and already looking for some key information. In some of the other communities that have done these sort of workshops, there's been a similar type of engagement to what we've done. Obviously, it's all been affected by COVID in terms of the type of in-person workshops that we'd ideally do, but we have gotten a lot of input of people's environmental priorities through that process, and we certainly want to, well, the whole point of Reimagine, or one of the main points, is not to duplicate efforts, so we really want to take everything we can out of that engagement process and use it to distill some community priorities. And as I mentioned, we're reviewing existing plans and documents for indicators and talking to staff about things that they're thinking about and new ways that they're looking at monitoring or assessing progress. I know the Economic Development Strategy has some really innovative thinking in it, and our Economic Development Officer is working on some indicators for that. And of course, using the tools that are available through DEAL and potentially, well, hopefully meeting with them soon. I know they're very busy folks, but they graciously made themselves available to us in the near future.
Yeah, you may want to say what DEAL is.
Oh, Donut Economics Action Lab. Yeah. Sorry about that. Acronym alert.
Acronym.
So that is it as far as my PowerPoint. I wanted to keep it kind of snappy because I knew that some of you have gone into this in great depth, whereas other of you maybe a little bit less. But ready to take any questions on this, or if not, we can go straight into your discussion with Rob.
Well, or combine the two, actually.
Well, yeah, basically. Well, if you know more about the environmental stuff than I do, though.
Yeah, so Rob, I don't know if there's anything you want to add with respect to your report, but I think it's probably best if we just combine the two, and I agree with you, there's probably a lot of overlap between the two.
Yeah, well, I'm just going to simply say the table is the starting point, and as I say briefly earlier in the presentation, I just tried to kind of break it up into air, water, and land kind of focused indicators. But many of these, there's a range of, some of them are current indicators that we already manage already, and some of them are from the regional growth strategy, but also there's some indicators that are potentially available if we want to use them, and I'm kind of thinking of the drinking watershed and watershed protection, citizen science assessments of water quality around the region, including several creeks within the city, just as an example of a local indicator that could be looked at going forward. But there's certainly a range of types of indicators, and some of them are looking at, basically performance of the city, like how many permits or how quickly we react or provide a level of service to the community. Others are looking at kind of a threshold for example, water quality. So there's a bit of a range, and I suspect what we're going to be doing is really kind of picking and choosing as we go through Reimagine Nanaimo, and we discover there's certain indicators that are going to make more sense once we have more information, partly from the public input, but also when the scenario phase is completed, and we've done that challenge between looking at how we want to see the city and received input from the community and from council. I think that's going to help kind of really narrow the range of the types of indicators we decide to make the most sense. But this, I think, gives you a good starting point to see where we're thinking about. I don't necessarily want to go through each bullet point, but if you have a specific question or you want to actually add something or just provide comment, I'm certainly happy to hear that.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Karen. Turn it over to committee. Any questions, comments, and we'll just kick off discussion. And I think we do have the recommendation, but ask staff to sort of participate in that so we can get those questions answered and unpack any comments people may have. Anyone want to jump in? Jerome.
We'll start, I guess. I have, I guess it's a question, a bit of a concern. I'm wondering strongly how or why we don't have listed right now an idea or an effort, I guess, to try to drive some of the indicators from the existing committee. My concern is that right now we're relying heavily on this Reimagine Nanaimo process that's already started. And I think that in the way that the information is gathered, there's a strong selection bias by those that respond. You might have the people that are really dislike everything that's going on and some that find that it works great. I'm not sure how representative it is, and it might be one part of the data set that you want to be integrating, but in my mind, the donut, one of the major benefits is the fact that it's kind of holistic and integrative in its structure, and that it would really, really be helpful if we could effectively have, committee members or representatives sit down together and define what the indicators are going to be to ensure that these indicators are actually coordinated between the committees. So what I mean by this is, say, if you are thinking about the health and housing or the future development of houses, it has an impact on the economic development of a neighborhood in the city, which has an impact on the transportation that has to, go along with it, which has an impact on the greenhouse gas emissions for this committee. So this is an example of a topic where it's beneficial to make sure that somebody from these three different groups of committees or plans has a discussion to articulate those three things together. And so then you end up with indicators that are not just siloed to each committee, but they're actually, from the get-go, they're designed to be integrating the goals of each committee. I don't know if that makes sense. And I'm not seeing that as part of the process to define the indicators.
So to understand sort of the concern there is want to know how this all comes together and how the cohesiveness of the model is captured by all the different inputs to be integrated fully in a way that makes sense.
Exactly.
Rob, Karen?
I'll take a crack, sure. Well, I can say certainly staff have a level of expertise to help with preparing some of this information, and I think as Karen had mentioned, we've had a discussion with the design lab about doing more, having a deeper discussion about the process and how we can better integrate that into the Reimagine Nanaimo. So that's kind of an ongoing
Yeah, Jerome,
conversation.
I think, like, I hear your concern, and I think maybe I wasn't doing a good job in articulating the next step for the city portrait. So with the city portrait, we're looking at those 4 lenses, and that's an interdepartmental team that's working on that to bring back to council. And there will be input from all these different domains, looking at how they cross over. You know, we work very intimately with transportation and environment. I work primarily on social housing and social planning issues. So we are working interdepartmentally and across different sectors. I think that the way that the lenses are developed chunks it out in one way, but we'll be looking at how these things influence each other, and that there'll be a lot of chance for discussion as we develop this portrait. But I hear your concern, and I totally agree with you that one thing does influence. I mean, that's kind of the point, right? One thing influences everything else.
But there will be other renditions of all 4 lenses that will be out for discussion and review at later points.
It's an iterative process. I think this is just sort of our first opportunity to come to you to hear about some of your thoughts and priorities, because I know you wouldn't be on an environment committee unless you thought about these things deeply.
Thank you.
Is that where you wanted to jump in there?
Yes, please. First of all, I think actually there is some good opportunity to look at the synergies between, with the ECDEV environment, and we also have the Accessibility Inclusion Committee. Jerome, I think that's what you were suggesting, those kinds of pieces, looking at what staff come up with. I think that's a great idea, and I think we can provide opportunity to that to the consultants. And then the other thing I wanted to note that probably is maybe not clear, and council will be getting a report from us soon, is that one of the things we did with feedback on Reimagine was we had a statistically valid survey done, as well as the online, and tried to look at having representation from different demographics. So I think we are feeling quite relieved and confident that from at least from the community side, which is a bit different than the technical stuff you're talking about, I think you might be pleasantly surprised about some of the priorities that are coming through that. And I think once we present it to the GPC on the 8th, depending on the preference of the chairs and all of you, we could come back and go into a bit more depth about some of the results of phase 1 engagement and how that ties in. So just some thoughts around that.
Sure. I mean, okay, thanks for that clarification. I didn't mean to say that the whole thing's invalid. My point is simply that there's a completely different perspective on what can be done or not done from the standpoint of the committee.
Yeah.
And that linkage wasn't clear to me. Ideally, you have both. My thinking was along the lines of, why don't we just get the committee to set some key priorities that some people may not even be aware of that are, going on in the city, and then try to sort of craft something that integrates a bit of everything together. But you're telling me that that's what's going on, so that's good.
It can always be improved, and I think what you're saying though is that they have these other committees, and we've been coming to you separately.
Yeah.
We've been going to the community with everything integrated, how we live, how we move, how we care, into silos. With the committees, we maybe have an opportunity to do something where I don't know how much, Ledge Services is probably not going to be very happy with me suggesting this, but we have something where we have that representation of those different groups, giving feedback to what we're hearing from the wider community, and giving you something to respond to and add to and give input to. So I hope I'm not facing a bit of a problem here for anybody, but I don't think I think it works well with the approach we're taking. And I think it works well when we get into phase 2 of the process which we're starting, to look at scenarios and then the measuring that goes with how we're evaluating our future land use and environmental policies.
So part of my concern is just that, you move to phase 2, but if you move to phase 2 with a set of indicators that you later regret or feel are not quite adequate, then let's make sure that we get them right the first time or initially. And sometimes if you realize the connections, I think everybody agrees on this, you narrow down your list of indicators to much fewer, but they end up having much more weight, because then you realize right from the start that they were built to be integrated, rather than later thinking, oh yeah, that kind of works with this and this kind of works with that, but they're fundamentally, from the ground, they were built not to be integrated together. And that's my concern, right? That's my concern of, like, if we're adopting an integrated model, let's make sure that it's built from that standpoint from the start.
So,
I'll be quiet now.
no, we're here. We're here to speak and discuss and debate, and provide guidance. So, we don't ever want anyone to be quiet. So, anybody, else have comments, questions?
Well,
Wally?
Yeah, two areas. One, I've had a lot of experience with indicators in a whole bunch of areas, and quite often we find indicators are there to measure numbers without somebody understanding what the numbers are supposed to tell us. Every indicator needs to be really thoroughly vetted as to what's the purpose of the indicator, what's it tell us, why does it tell us something, and what are we going to do with it? If we're just going to have a number for the sake of having a number, it's actually not very useful. The other thing I wanted to say was, I hope there's a lot of dialogue going on right now, and if you look at the Mayor's Task Force on Economic Development as well, the form and type of industry that we might attract in Nanaimo is very different. I just had the real estate report for the last couple of months and listening to other cities as well, and some of the American cities. Single-family houses are selling like hotcakes. Condos and multis are not except for affordability for those that have them. New York is suffering, I understand, a huge departure of people with the pandemic who are saying we don't want to live in dense environments. That may have a lot of effects. I hope you're going to play the what-if game with all of these scenarios where we go, because we're also hearing, I heard a very great presentation the other day from an economist for downtown development in Vancouver, and saying, what's the future of office towers? What's the future of people working at home? What's the future of transportation systems? Do we need the level of transportation do we have now? Do we need the level of road network? So I really hope that, as this is a plan looking forward 20 years, if this stuff's just evolving now, I strongly recommend that we assure we play the what-if game on these, because things are changing rapidly.
Wally? Yeah, it's definitely hard to get an idea of the future, so. Anybody else? I do have a question, so I'll jump in and then move back to anybody else. So one thing I guess I'm always worried about is when we're talking about, well, here we're talking about the environment. When we're talking about the environment, we know there's major ecological or biodiversity loss. We know about the GHGs, and often we, I think, preemptively limit ourselves by saying, what's within our budget to control. And I think there's a danger there, because I don't think, to use an extreme example, but I do think it fits. During World War II, they didn't start with, well, what is the level of war response we can afford under current taxation? Rather, they said, what is it going to take for us to win this war and have the war effort necessary, and then budgets follow accordingly. And so, sometimes, the concern of mine is that I think on these big issues where we can't fully conceive of how big they are, but we know they're big, we have to start from a place of, if we are going to meet these objectives, what is the actual change that needs to happen? And even if that dollar sign comes back as something that's very, very hard to stomach, which I expect it would be, we at least have a clear understanding of the problem, and then from there we can make the decision, do we rise to the challenge or not? Are we comfortable with exceeding that? And so that's something I really want to make sure that what we are setting is our goals, and ultimately our indicators are derived from that hard science, and as much as possible that technical exercise. What actually needs to happen, even if we don't like some of the numbers or some of the changes that it might throw up in our face. So just put that out there as a concern and a comment, and something I really will be looking for in those indicators from my personal perspective is, are they concerned with that final outcome that is truly trying to define the scope of the problem?
Just briefly to add, and something to think about too, is And really, when you're thinking about the next phase, it's about compromise. And there may be some assumptions we're making now that we may need to compromise about, whether that's the economy, whether that's how we build in the future, whether that's the environment that needs to be done to adjust all the different perspectives that are being discussed right now as part of this process. And I think that, going through that process, again, that's going to help us kind of understand which indicators are the most relevant. Anyway.
Agree, and I think with the donuts, the ecological lens or the ecological ceiling, the goal there is to actually establish whatever that hard limit is in terms of resources, and then things have to fit in accordingly. And I think the reality is we might not like what that limit looks like for the foreseeable future. Any other questions or comments?
I would just add to that, along the same lines, that it's very easy for us to come up with indicators and then, or not very easy, we can come up with indicators and then it's a parallel discussion to have, effectively to rank them, and you're going to find that there are going to be some really easy ones and some hard ones to achieve. There's going to be some cheap ones, there's going to be some really expensive ones, and some that are, beyond imagination, and there are some going to take a year, some going to take 5 years, and some going to take 15 or 20 years, and obviously we can't hit them all. So I think the idea of a framework as it's hopefully in the process being developed is that you set even those furthest, most expensive and hardest to reach goals, because that gives you you're shooting for something, and then you set yourself some intermediate steps. Like anything, you never get to the end goal or the end point the first try necessarily, but you lay out milestones for yourself. And I think we should probably think of it in that sense, rather than just deciding that this is a yes or a no. Everything's possible but achievable at different rates and with different costs, and more easily or more with more difficulty.
Tyler, I got a comment here. So yeah, just building off Tyler's comments, and just as I've been kind of reflecting on this process that's sort of organically taking shape as we sort of integrate a portrait with a reimagined. And I guess that the first is just around setting the series of indicators that we're going to use. I think like with the donut model, there was these ecological limits that are sort of evidence-based so far of these limits that we can't exceed, or else of environmental collapse. And then there's some that we don't even know what the global limit is yet, say for plastic absorption or whatever. But that kind of sets one end of the basis of what indicators we need to be tracking. And then we've got to look at what does that look like here. So for example, like Amsterdam have got issues, I forget, it was like a lot of agricultural phosphorus release. So that was one that was chosen that was like very suitable for their context. So in the Nanaimo process, we're going to have to look at sort of like what are those hard environmental limits, and some might be determined sort of what our per capita responsibility would be. So for example, like for GHGs, if we're going to hit the IPCC target, there's sort of a per capita GHG that we're allowed, and then from there we backtrack to what we're allowed here in Nanaimo. Or it could be sort of the ecological footprint concept. So if everybody in the world had an equal amount of land that was allotted to them to provide their material world, I think it's like 3 hectares of land or something like that. What would that look like in Nanaimo in terms of our per capita waste disposal? And we'll use per capita amount of waste as an indicator, goal, and target. Then I was like looking at Vancouver, so they had the Greenest City initiative, and basically what they did is like, okay, we want to be the greenest city. They didn't really benchmark off of ecological limits. They just looked at what are all the other cities doing, and in terms of tree cover, modal shift, and that. And if we want to be the greenest city, all we need to do is beat the top ones, and they set those as their target. And then that was their indicator. And so some indicators are like aspirational, or goals that we want to attain. There's some goals that we have to attain to be environmentally responsible, but I guess my first question is like, within our environmental framework, where does discussion happen of what goals are we setting ourselves as a community of what we want to attain? Is it determined by just our ecological limits, or are some determined by the Reimagine Nanaimo process discussion and being like, okay, we want to plant 150,000 trees or whatever, and using some of those specific goals as the metric indicators to track. I mean, yeah, so the question is like, where in that process and Reimagine are we going to be having the discussion of goals?
I can elaborate and give you an example. So for a lot of the parks, we often get a professional biologist to do an assessment, like basically a biological assessment of a lot of different factors for each park, either at the time of acquisition or as part of a park master plan or a park plan. And then you get a pretty good sense of what the state of that park is ecologically. And unfortunately, a lot of them are in bad shape, ecologically speaking. There's a lot of open space, there's a lot of trails, but you can find a lot of areas with a lot of heavy infestation of a variety of invasive species. And it's just a fact of the way it was, up to this time and how the land was used. But I think there's a recognition that needs to be turned around, and there are a lot of people out there in the community, all the parks, working on that. But definitely we need targets to how do we turn this around, and what do we want to see ourselves in 2030, 2040 as far as tree canopy cover, biological diversity. So whatever indicator is appropriate for that for Nanaimo, have that as a goalpost, and then measure that as we keep going forward and starting to turn this around. I mean, for me, I can see that as an issue. Urban streams is another. I know there's a lot of local interest in the health of our urban streams and just having something like that close in your neighborhood. So fish values, riparian biodiversity, all that is really key. And again, invasive species, erosion and sediment control concerns in the water, all those are issues. And I guess that helps you kind of pick those indicators, I think, as you kind of work through all that. And there's other issues, obviously, but that's just a couple of examples.
May I add to that, Rob?
Sure.
I think maybe the answer is both, especially when you look at the lenses. For cities of the north, which typically have the higher consumption rates, those global impacts is where the hard limits come into play, because we look at what is our responsibility to the earth and our fair share globally, and that goes into feeding, developing those scenarios that we were discussing earlier and that Tyler was mentioning, the chair was mentioning. So they have that aspect of it, and then for the local, what does it take for people to thrive locally? I think that is where we'll see a lot more of those specific Nanaimo values. And for something like the local social, maybe there'll be a community where the number of festivals that can survive in a year is an indicator. If there was a community where music festivals are really important and that came through. So it's quite specific to the community, but I see the environmental limits aspect much more in the global ecological lens, if that makes sense to you, Rob.
Makes sense to me.
Sure. And the next question that I had was, in terms of process, like, so say for example for Reimagine Nanaimo, we've had phase one, we've heard from the community on these sort of like themes, and the donut sort of come in midstream now, and we're starting to integrate this framework in. What I was like thinking is like, what I would like is that, taking that information and staff working on it, we've got sort of like these social indicators and these environmental indicators, to like have that discussion around goals, and then sort of these hard limits, and then have like a set of indicators and goals that we can produce out of like the committees and through staff, and then would those go back out then, get that completed so that the next round of public engagement, that's what's presented. Like, here, these are the things that we want to track. These are the goals that we want to achieve over the next 20 years. Hey, community, what are your thoughts on this? Is this meeting your expectations, or are there goals or indicators that we've missed or that we need to improve to flush that out? And I guess that I'm just curious on the process of that.
Lisa, I'm going to turn to you a little bit on the process, because I know you've had more discussion with senior management on the order of things. Certainly every element of what you've said is there at phase two, but whether we would finalize the city portrait with council before we do the public engagement on the scenarios, or whether the city portrait, the indicators themselves would be part of the public engagement in phase two, I'm not sure that's clear to me. Rob, is it clear to you? So Sorry, Lisa, not to put you on the spot.
I'm on the spot.
Well, that's why we're having this discussion though, so
Yeah.
we can get it on the table and then it's something we can look into.
Yeah, Ben, to answer your question, so one approach is that we do have, fortunately, because we have others before us, yes, the contexts are different because they're either, in Portland or in Amsterdam. We do have the beginning framework through the donut through which to evaluate, and we have many parallels that I guess we're already tracking down with our existing approach to this. It actually aligns in my mind, it aligns very nicely in phase 2. And phase 2 is about, we've gone and gotten phase 1 engagement, we've gotten the community priorities on a range of integrated, in fact, all of the aspects of donut in terms of the community well-being have been, we've gotten that feedback from the community. So in phase 2, our job is to develop different scenarios, and I think it was Jerome or maybe Wally talking about how do we look at these scenarios and develop them and evaluate them, and that's where the process is, I think, and maybe this is what you're getting at, is having a clear idea of what the measures are to evaluate as we are looking at developing the scenarios.
Yeah, I think the question was, Lisa, was whether council would finalize what the indicators are. I know the scenario, so if you think about what the indicators can be set before you decide what your targets are, right? So say if we say tree canopy, we decide for sure that's an indicator, but then we're like, there's an ambitious 100% tree canopy scenario, and then there's a less ambitious 75, and then there's the status quo 50, and then that would be the engagement portion to be looking at not what the indicator is, but which scenario meets which targets. And I believe our approach was going to be try and finalize the city portrait as soon as possible in terms of the indicators, and then base the scenarios around that, and the engagement being done on the scenarios, not the indicators themselves.
Right.
But I just was trying to confirm that with Lisa because she's had more contact with senior management on the flow of things than I have.
Karen, I don't think we fleshed everything out perfectly, but I think how you framed it is the direction in which we're going, because we were actually waiting. Our next step, as you know, is you, Rob, and our team are looking at getting that portrait and that flow, as you said. So I guess the question is whether we formally go to council with that, or we have that with the endorsement of committees like this, and others, and use that. There's a piece around the scenario development that does tie back. And I'm not being very articulate on this one.
No, that makes sense.
And then we may, as we go, particularly as we change and look at different scenarios and get feedback, we may go back and reassess some of those indicators. So it's not, we might be remiss in getting too firm too quickly. Is my thought.
That makes sense.
That makes sense.
Makes sense to me.
I hope that sort of answers your question.
The chair, sorry, I'm doing a poor job of speaking through the chair, those types of processes, but.
It's okay, it's a little more informal here, so it's all good.
Thanks. What your thoughts are around this? I think, and this is really exciting, and I think the timing is just perfect for this stage in the process, because the engagement, even if we had adopted the donuts before we'd had the engagement and had to realign with COVID, this is exactly all that information just aligns so nicely. The formation of these committees actually aligns so nicely with the donut. I mean, maybe you would argue that instead of an environment committee, it would be a holistic one committee, but we have all the elements of the donut sprinkled through all the committees of council. And that's why with the, I think I made a sprinkled donut.
Yeah, there's tons.
Add tons there, but, and that's council endorsed. We can have a lot of fun with donuts, guys. I'm wanting to bring tidbits with rainbows and sprinkles. But that's why council, when we looked at the reimagined structure, is the voice of committees like yours was really fundamental. So instead of
having one steering committee for Reimagine that had maybe just one Lisa Frey or one Jerome representing environment, we actually get a bigger voice by having separate environment committees and the accessibility inclusion. And so council's the overall steerer of this on behalf of the community. And then you guys are the key pieces or elements and ingredients that support that back up. And then we have the community at large. So perhaps I'm sounding overly enthusiastic, but there's still things we're figuring out, but I think that we're really on track to working well with this concept and embedding it. So that's my perspective, and I know that the wobble is that we've never done it quite this way before, or realigned things
How many cities have?
before. And so there's a bit of uncertainty that comes with that, and trust in how that's going to work out. But I will say that we are very grateful as staff to have the ability to tap into this community or this committee, which is very different than having maybe one environment expert sitting on a Reimagine team. We get a different breadth with this committee, the Economic Development Task Force. So I hope that helps, and I think Jerome had a really good point about, how do we bridge councils that bridge up here, definitely into all of these committees and steering them, whether it's Dawn on health and housing or Tyler on this committee. How do we bring that all together to make sure that everybody's synergized instead of us separately having the conversations? I think maybe that's what it's picking up a little bit, Jerome. And I think that's a good idea, and I think we haven't quite wrapped our heads around that. And, with COVID, we have all kinds of interesting opportunities to do that through online polls with a larger group, facilitated sessions, not quite as fun as doing it in person, which would be the ideal type of thing that we would love to do, but we may be able to come up with the comfort of your own home, polling you on different pieces that we've researched, and maybe one or two of you giving us feedback ahead of time. So I haven't quite figured it out in my head, but this is where we're going in phase 2. Phase 2 is actually the most fun part of the process, and I think the donut provides us with that really clear lens to make the linkage with what we're trying to do with our community. So I will stop there because it's getting a little enthusiastic. So.
Thanks, Lisa. And just like donuts, donuts is a single category with lots of different flavors in it. So we gotta figure out our flavor and go for it. So no, I think it's totally okay that we put this on you, and it is a different framework. It is looking at things, trying to look at things a little differently, and there's a lot of familiar elements, but there's also a little bit of a fresher perspective that maybe it's a forward-looking perspective, and that's if anyone that did read that Time article, it's not a lot of people are doing it. It's gaining traction, and that could be a good thing. That can be a bad thing. We'll always find out. But it's not easy to sort of point to your neighboring jurisdiction and say, hey, how did you do this? So appreciate all you folks that are working on this daily, trying to navigate that and help move council and these committees and also the community through that. And like any new thing, the mistakes will be made, and hopefully, to Jerome's point, we'll recalibrate and find the path forward. So. It's okay not to have it all fully flushed out. That's why we're here. So, any questions on this or comments through staff? Some good discussion. So, there's more. Let's keep it going.
I've got more, Tyler, but I'll wait here and open it up for another round, but I've got a couple more.
Okay. Anyone else? We'll go to Ben. Benjamin, I think it's you. Okay,
so just on the process of selecting indicators, so it's one, identifying sort of what those limits are, and then looking down, and then also what goals are relatable to what we want to track our progress meeting. And so the indicators that Rob put into the initial report is a sampling of certain ones that we could look at, and I looked at the City of Vancouver, greenest cities, and all the different indicators that they had. They had some around food security, that had some neat ones around green business and business, using business licensing to be able to get some data. And they use a lot of survey. And then Saanich has interesting, they've got progress indicators for their strategic plan. And they've got an excellent table there that sort of like has like medium, long, short-term range indicators, and then sort of the sources of their indicators that they're using. And you know, a few that we touched on, and then there are some other new ones that are interesting. But you know, there's a lot of examples of different indicators that people are looking at, and I think to Tyler's point, we do have to identify like the resources to be able to track, like who's collecting the data, how's it being reported, and I think you know, it is a question like, is there going to be a certain point, sort of like a resource allocation decision? Be like, okay, ideally, we'd like to track these set of indicators. If we do that, we're going to be able to give the best progress tracking that we can and report back, and to be able to like really be responsive to how we're doing. But it's going to cost X amount to monitor this particular indicator, and we're going to have to maybe up our staffing, or there might be changes in the reporting structure, whatever that needs to be done to actually get it in there. When does that conversation happen, or was that conversation, like, is this going to be ongoing, or well, we might need to increase our staffing resource and ability to track some of these things that we don't know?
Well, I mean, that's the conversation too, is do we pick something and go for it no matter what, or do we recognize that as a unique community, you know, there's certain things that maybe we don't need to go into because it's not, because the hill you have to climb to get there to maintain and monitor, but there's other things that are more appropriate and unique to the community that we can do. And I think we'll discover that as we kind of walk through this. And we have some of those in the report as an example. There are some things that I think have been talked enough already, like canopy cover. There is a level of expertise which we have in-house, and there is some mapping capability that's needed to do that. And I think we have the pieces already. It's just getting the direction, is that's what we're going to be tracking, and this is the target we want to reach by 2030 or whatever it is. We just need to get to that point. But that can be one indicator that we can work toward. And I think we're getting to the point where we have the pieces now that we can kind of move on with that. But anyway.
Do you think it will probably be part of the consideration, though, like Jeremy's nodding his head, I don't know if you want to speak to this, Jeremy, but it will be part of the consideration on what to bring forward, what's reasonable in terms of an expectation?
Yeah, I mean, we'll look at different sources, what we can currently access or are currently monitoring, and you know, what the costs versus the benefits are of different indicators. You know, you can look at different measures to kind of try and get to the same point, and we'll get some advice on that from the consulting team as well. So they'll have some good advice on that as well.
Like I know at the Regional District of Nanaimo, like some of their indicators, they haven't had data available for many years. And so we want to avoid that situation where it might not even be a matter of staff resources, but the data just isn't available or realistic to get in our geography.
Well, we had that problem with our original climate mitigation targets. The province wasn't giving us the data, although they initially promised that. Yeah. So, of course, that kind of created that whole delay.
Yeah. So we'll need reliable, repeatable, you know, comparable, all that will have to come out. So.
And then another question is just in terms of like corporate business planning, like annual cycle. Is it a change for us as the city of Nanaimo to build a much closer relationship with indicators, interannual or biannual or every 4-year cycle of planning to like closely monitor and use like a regular reporting on indicators to adjust policy direction and report back to council on progress on certain items? Is that a big change, or like, is it something that could we embrace more wholly to make it very like goal orientated, with, you know, that type of feedback cycle? Is that something that is a change for us, or that we're already doing, or we can embrace more?
We do service delivery stats now, right? Like how much development permits or how much water has been conserved, and those things, different things get tracked already by different departments as kind of a monitoring mechanism.
Because I guess kind of like what I see is like every year, whatever is appropriate for the indicator, there'll be like a presentation to council, which would give sort of a public update on where is our progress on these indicators, where do we stand, and then a process to evaluate what we've been doing at this point on our progress, tracking these things, and then a chance for the corporate body to adjust whatever it needs to do in case we're moving in the wrong direction of these indicators. One as a way to track our progress, and two, to communicate sort of this vision of what we're trying to accomplish as a community. So that's kind of just my understanding of like why having this donut framework and series of indicators.
Thanks, man. I saw a couple hands go up. Before I go to them, I just had a thought, maybe a foolish thought, but I'm going to throw it out there just for staff's consideration, the committee's consideration is, maybe there's some inspiration to be taken from the donut here in saying, these are our categories. These are what we can track currently. These are what we would love to track, but we just have no idea, and it's a work in progress, and we'll get to them at some point. I just think of that model. It's got the red sections where we've overshot and all those sort of things, and so in the realm of knowability. But then there's those gray sections where, all likelihood we've overshot them, but we haven't developed the appropriate methodology or the way to measure them yet, and it's aspirational in the sense that we know we got to get there at some point, but we're just not currently there for one reason or the other. Lisa, and then I saw Bill.
I might be speaking, I'm going to ask Dale and Bill if they remember. I wasn't at the city at the time, but there was a time when the cities do report cards, and they were actually excellent. I actually asked for copies of how they were done, and they were done for a series of years by, I think, Brian Clemens, and they were used to do exactly what Ben was saying, to adjust and tweak policy. So with that, I'm going to stop and maybe let Bill speak.
Bill.
I was actually, thanks Lisa, and speaking to Ben's point, similarly, there are a number of reports, but currently they're perhaps collected at random, like Rob, I'm thinking of the CARET report.
Yeah.
Here's and this is really an opportunity for us to bring all of that together, and as you said, Tyler, there may be stuff that we don't know, or we don't know what the safe limits are, but we measure something, maybe particulates in the air as an example. But I think that it's just a matter of all departments getting together and putting a cohesive report of these indicators, and then, but with the lens of the donut, we can frame it in a better way, if that makes sense. Dale, I don't know if you want to add it.
Maybe not.
Smiling.
Or you can put me, I get you last sentence, or...
If you want to.
No, the only thing that I wanted to add, thanks for that, Bill. The only thing I wanted to add was, I agree with Lisa. I mean, whatever you come up with, we need to have a way that's easily communicated and reported back on, in my opinion, annually. And there's other things that we do that with now, like, for example, the affordable housing strategy. We're just getting ready to come back with kind of an annual report card. We have targets in our strategy. This will allow us to do, more integrated reporting back, but absolutely, whatever we come up with, we need to be on top of, report back, and most importantly, report back in a way that the community appreciates and can respond to. I think we've done a little bit of that maybe now, in terms of that first with the statistically valid survey we're doing for the community, just kind of getting their thoughts on where the city sits on a number of issues. and maybe that forms part of the basis going forward, but, yeah, I think whatever you do, having the ability to, at the end of the day, if we're going to go out and ask the community their thoughts, it's always important that we follow up with them and communicate with them.
And actually, could I just add, and hopefully I'm not preempting, Dale, you can add a bit more. As part of Reimagine and also part of the ECDEV strategy, already taking into account that measurement and that dashboard concept, and staff are exploring how to have exactly that tool and build that. So whether it is our population growth regularly updating every time somebody has a baby and exaggerating, but there are other that dashboard tool and how we can do that visibly and interactively. So then you don't have to, well, we can report out once a year. There's interim things that people are seeing. Wow, in March we really were down on our water use. What was the implications? And people can see the impact of their behavior, because there's two pieces, right? We want people in our community to take individual action, and then we want us as a city to be responsive, and then we want our partners in the region and province to also help us with different elements that they control. And anyway, I was just very, very pleased to hear that led by our economic development team, we're looking at that concept that will also incorporate all of the different indicators. But we're looking at it with that lens in mind. Dale, you might have a little bit more than me on that, but that's the exciting thing about this integrated piece across departments, and everybody, just, everybody's thinking donuts, right? So that's
Donuts all the way down.
I don't have anything more to add on that, Lisa, but I do like the idea of reporting back more than annually. And I do, we've kind of talked about, I've seen other communities put it under this umbrella of smart city, where they take their real-time data and display it in a way the community can absorb. And there's lots of things I can think of off the top of my head that we do. I think people would be interested in, like the water quality sampling we do in the Parch Bay all the time. Something we could share and people could see trends. And I think, the level at the reservoir that Bill has that we report on every day, and people can see where we are in the middle of the drought and how much water is left. And those kind of real-time, air quality, there's a number of things that can go on. But, having that real-time dashboard, I really like that idea.
Any additional comments? I had something that I wanted to share, and I could try to share my screen just briefly to show it. And it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I want to make sure whatever we do in reporting, it's not always geared towards painting a good news story. It's geared towards painting an honest story. And I'm going to show this graph. It's a very real graph that actually has an overlay of, I think, someone that's an 11 or 12-year-old female. And I think it's just very telling. So I'll just share my screen. Let's see here. So can everyone see that?
The bars? Yeah. Blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, so that's Canada's GHG emissions from 2000 to 2018. And I think what's ultimately telling is that there's been lots of talk about progress and policy mechanisms and all these great things that we're doing. And, our population has gone up, and things. Everything that we're doing is putting us on the path of a trajectory that is at least 3 degrees warming plus. And I just love this blah, 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 because someone that participates in being one of those blahs, it's very true in a lot of ways. And so, I share that because I think it's important that, it's okay to admit when our policy mechanisms fall short, because that's when, that's why we track things, so we can course correct. So I'm going to stop sharing now, but I hope that whatever we do, that, we are, celebrating successes is always important, but being very honest where our policy mechanisms are falling down in need of change or course correction.
So you make a good point, because how do you make it real for an average person to just understand how we're progressing? And maybe looking at your bar graph there, maybe that's absolute GHGs, but what would happen if you did it per capita? So how much carbon is emitted nationally per person, and then kind of make it more personal that way? It would be kind of interesting to track that chart, and I think it would kind of relate more to people too.
It would, but I would very much caution against that because global temperatures doesn't care about per capita; it cares about total parts per million of carbon equivalent.
Yeah, but your example though just illustrates that. Technically, having absolute numbers, that makes sense for us to reach our targets, but it doesn't relate to the individual. It's kind of like maybe having that in context as well. How do you make it relatable and easy to understand while trying to reach your targets?
Yeah, there's a role for both, right? You got to personalize it, but also, present the hard reality. Elise.
In continuation of what both Lisa and Tyler expressed, there's a really beautiful installation in one of the Vienna train stations, and where there's like the underground, the underground terminus, and there's like a mirror, but then behind the glass, there's a bunch of digits that are like the hectares or what have you of desert in the world, and you just stand and you look at yourself and your reflection, and then the numbers are just going up. But it could also be like the amount of water conserved this month, but it's just like really stark, and it's just numbers, and you can interpret numbers. A fact is just a fact. It doesn't have to have any emotion to it. It's just what the viewer interprets it as. But I think that's like a really cool example of sharing, maybe as we're trying to say, maybe more localized data that people can relate to more. But it's in those public terminus.
These are like hockey billboards, this much water.
Oh, yeah.
So,
Tyler, I got one more.
it's been good discussion.
Cool.
Oh, okay, Ben, go ahead.
I just got one more question. Like, I'm just curious on people's thoughts. We worked a little bit on this city environmental framework that we put when we started. That was like when we first started this conversation around frameworks.
It's on the website, yeah.
And then it sort of ballooned into more globalized framework that's now in with our OCP. I'm just curious how we see the further development of the city environmental framework. Are we really going to so much like park that in a sense? And
it's done.
Yeah,
it's done.
Yeah,
we're in the donut world now.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. that was my question.
That would be my answer.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. No, I think that captures it. And then just in terms of this committee, I'm curious if I'd be interested in giving the committee members homework of doing some research on frameworks and indicators and goals, and seeing stuff that they think could be a good idea, or we're not looking at what other jurisdictions are doing in that, and come back at the next meeting and have just a bit more of a dialogue on that. I don't know if that fits in with our process, or if that could be a... Well,
and actually the next meeting's like the second week of March, so it's not actually that far away. I guess, for me, a challenge, and maybe it's a question for the committee, is thinking about global indicators. Like, I know I can think of lots of local indicators, and I'm sure that some of the committee members can too, but obviously the obvious one is the IPCC target for greenhouse gases, but there may be others that we should be thinking about that escape us. And I thank you, Wally, very much for the report, because you actually gave us indicators that kind of look at it regionally or on an island. So it makes me wonder, does it have to be a global target? Can we really be looking at ourselves on an island basis? And maybe our target should be like Vancouver Island focused, and that can be the approach we take for the donut. Does it have to be global?
I'll give you a perfect. What I think is a perfect example of the integration of the donut. So, we can take any given product or any given widget that's imported, say it's imported from China or wherever, we can probably trace in some fashion what the cost of travel is, and GHG and the consumption and all those sort of things, the energy. And then we can look at that from a very, so we can, in terms of waste, GHG, there's probably a bunch of targets we can track that local consumption on a global level. But now we can also tie that particular thing to in economics through, say, import replacement. So if we are able to generate that item similarly locally, it has a direct economic benefit locally. while also achieving some of those environmental goals. And so I think that's the integration piece that is so important that we don't lose sight of is, there might be real strong policies in an economic development strategy around import replacement that have a direct benefit to starting to pull some of that economic production back under the ecological scene. And how you capture that, that's the challenge. It's not an easy thing, but I think that's what it speaks to what Jerome was bringing up earlier, is how crucial some of that integration is, because one policy mechanism can cover a lot of bases in different places, but they're synergistic in a lot of ways. Jerome?
The first thing is I'm really glad we're having this discussion. I think this is one of the more substantive meetings we've had in a long time in terms of getting into some real details of things. At the same time, how we measure things and exactly how we measure and communicate it, I don't know, because it's going to be entirely dependent on what we're trying to measure. As Wally said, that's going to be entirely dependent on how we actually define these targets or these, what we're aiming for. And so it's almost a bit of it's good that we're thinking about it, but there's no answer to be had until we actually spend. The hard part is going to be exactly nailing down what we think that those aspirational goals are going to be. And so, great to have that discussion and thinking about it, but I would prefer we spend our time, and as Ben is saying, if we have homework, what are we going to try to do? What are going to be the indicators? And the GHG is a good example. I mean, the global GHG or local GHG, there's a latency built into that system that will far exceed any amount of time we spend trying to do some effort. So we have to do something, but if you want to have something measurable where you see the needle moving, it's not going to happen globally, just because of the way that system works. So that's a fool's errand to try to measure it and sort of communicate how great we're doing. We can do it locally, maybe, and we're going to have to find some ways of doing it, but we need to establish what those indicators are going to be. In a sense, the value and the buy-in to that model of the donut is going to live or die by the way that those indicators are framed. If they're completely like pie in the sky, crazy in terms of aspirations, and they're completely unachievable, there's no way people are going to buy into the concept, because it's just going to look like a pie in the sky effort. And so there's a real sort of delicate balance to strike in terms of how things are laid out for people. And there's a lot of resistance already to this idea of this donut economic model as if it's going to somehow upend the entire structure of the city and the way, the economics of this area are run. So in the short term, my thinking is it's all about indicators and nailing those in terms of how we define them and what we can realistically do with them.
Can I make a suggestion? So staff are busy pulling together, and they've already started pulling together indicators. Given that we are a bit challenged meeting in person, could we look at doing like an online half-day charrette with you guys? Maybe a couple of you give feedback to what we're going to consider in terms of those indicators and options, and then you all have a chance we can use online polling and do it that way, and try and also make it as fun as we're able to. I mean, this is a really heavy topic in many ways. But there's a nice energy that comes with it, and one of the reasons I think the donut was coined was to actually catch people's attention, right? Everybody in our community knows what a donut is. It has some catchiness. So anyway, if that's something that you think you'd be open to, I think that's something that staff would welcome, because it's part of us tapping into you as technical, like a resource.
I think that's a great idea. Personally, I think that's a great idea, Lisa. And I think the donut is catchy because it's totally ridiculous, but it works. That is.
Wally?
Wally.
Yeah, I just be careful. I recall, and Bill can help me with this, I guess, 10, 12 years ago when Al Kenning was CFO. There was a report card given to council, and it had like 40 or 50 indicators in it. It was not very useful. And there was a lot lot of very good data in it, but there was way too much and no explanation whatsoever of what they should be there. And that's why I suggested before, we should be very careful of the number of criteria that come forward and really that we're able to explain what they mean. I'll give you an example of the water system. We have a very, very good water system. We spend a fair amount of money on it every year. But one of the indicators was the average age of the pipes. Well, that's not going to move in 4 years to any point that it's going to be relevant to council. And there were numbers in there like that, so you're sort of giving council information that is really not very much used to them. And I'd be very, very careful that we understand why we are measuring something and why we think it should be reported and what the expectation is we want to do with the data, and keep it to a limited number that are very, very meaningful.
Good comments, Wally. Lisa?
Wally, thank you so much, because that is actually one of our great fears. And I think this is where you guys could really help us. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could get to under 12 meaningful indicators? Because if it's, and Wally, you mentioned the city having 41. I remember at the RDN they had, it was well over 100 indicators, and the book was like this, and nobody, it was, exactly. It was, so, Wally, I think what you say is our ultimate fear and what we want to avoid, and this is where we would really, I think, and maybe where the suggestion of a shred is, we have a lot of background work to do to narrow down, and your job is to actually help us narrow down and whittle down to what's practical and tangible, to then go out to the wider community and council with. So we'd be very grateful for that help, actually.
Okay, so here's a lot of conversation. I think it's a great conversation. I'm wondering, and Lisa, building off what I think is a very good idea, but we can find, but it could sound like a possible recommendation might be that a SHRED be scheduled to help refine environmental indicators for use in developing the city portrait for Nanaimo as part of the reimagined Nanaimo process. Did that work?
Should I ask if the other perspectives are going to be involved, or are they going to be done separately, like economics or social?
That's a very good question.
Are we going to be in isolation, or is there something similar going to happen from another perspective? Maybe that's another conversation.
Certainly that'd be ideal. Lisa, I don't know if you were intending to suggest the charrette be intercommittee, or if you meant just for the Environment Committee.
Well, I think based on Jerome's comments, I think there's a couple ways of doing it, and it's how to keep it manageable. Because with this small group, we get a lot of good feedback on their knowledge and expertise. The same with accessibility inclusion. I think there's some benefit to having everybody. We just have to figure out if, I don't know if there's a limit with Zoom that keeps it stable, but things that facilitate online polling. I think Zoom can support up to 40 or 50, maybe? I'm not sure. So it has to be very well organized, well facilitated to be meaningful. And the benefit of having, as I think where Rob and Karen, you're going, economic development and the other aspects, is we make sure that the indicators, there's some indicators that help us measure across different goals that we want to achieve.
Yeah.
And so it helps narrow it down collectively, and it helps the other committees hear your perspective. So it's just, for us as staff, our job is to go in and figure out the logistics and come back to you and say, this is how we think it's going to work. Karen and Rob, I think it's worthwhile considering something integrated to do it without, and make good use of people's time.
Yeah, we're going to talk about it tomorrow morning, I think.
Yeah. I think it would still work if the motion mentioned the Environment Committee. That's not going to mean that it's exclusively for the Environment Committee. It could still include others.
Yeah, so all the motion items are put on that a charrette be scheduled to help. We could just strike environmental and say, and then leave it to you folks to develop the program. But that a charrette be scheduled to help refine indicators for use in developing the city portrait for Nanaimo as part of the reimagined process. And say that's pretty open-ended for staff to develop the process.
And Lisa, just to be clear, sorry, you're right. I'm not in the process, I'm sorry.
I did hear from Jerome.
Okay, Jerome or Rob, do you?
Go ahead, Rob, I'll second after.
I'm just very quick, just a clarification, Lisa. So you mentioned 12 indicators. That's total, right? That's not just environmental we're talking about.
That's just a suggestion, Rob. It's not carved in stone. I think as we go through the process, I'm just looking at hearing Wally's concerns and having been through something similar. Ideally, I would say ultimately, if you could get it down to that, great. But this is a different process. So, you know, we have 10 that are local focus that we influence, and then we have another 10 that we track, that we advocate to government. You know, there's a different level.
That's fine, That just gives me an idea.
I don't have a bad outcome, Rob, in my head is for the committees to all work with us on. I was just more being with Wally. And you all have a dozen donuts from Tim Hortons. I think they sell them in 12, so I was thinking that if we work like that.
Oh no. Okay,
Can we have a baker's dozen?
Okay, so what I'm wondering through to staff here is, you know, I think there's a lot of good discussion. I don't know if there's necessarily a period yet at the end of it. You know, from what I'm hearing, it's an evolving process and might be able to come back. Ben, I see your hand up there. So I'm just wondering, is something like a motion that leaves it open-ended like that desired and workable?
Yeah, if I could, Chair, I'm just wondering how this relates to the motion that's recommended on the agenda. I'm not sure if the committee's into considering that at this point.
Yeah, so as to the whim of the committee here, I'm not sensing there was coalescing around that recommendation in the agenda just yet, but if someone is feeling that that's the way we're going and wants to move that, by all means as well. Okay, so I got Jerome and then Ben.
Well, I'm definitely in favor of this idea of a charrette. I don't think we need to have the whole committee necessarily. We could have representative of each committee, so that would narrow down the numbers, yet be representative of what the committees are thinking. And that means that we can also have discussions within the committee ahead of time, so we could have basically representatives that come with documents that have already been discussed within the committee, either at a meeting or outside of these meetings, because we can certainly circulate information beforehand. So I don't think that. I think the idea of having everybody at the table at once would be really beneficial, even for the initial sort of, you know, dump of ideas and discussion, and then from there, after that, they can go back to committee. I'd imagine that's an iterative process that we go through. It wouldn't be nailed down the first time around. So.
One other possibility is that I have seen with our Zoom world is whether you do breakout groups, and it doesn't matter whether you're environmental or whatever your group is, you could all break out and divvy up things, possibly. So we would just have to think about that and manage the technology. I know I've been in things where they've done Zoom breakout rooms, and that's often quite, but it requires pretty good facilitation. It's something that I think we can't achieve. So.
Thanks. First, I think the shred idea is a really great one. I think that it would be good to figure out a process to integrate and have other groups develop their indicators in that manner and then have a shared discussion at some point. I think figuring out the logistics of that is something that might need a bit more thought. I think initially it would be nicer to have a smaller group discussion focused with the environment folks, where we can just have, you know, the numbers necessary, the smaller numbers to really get in depth and have the full discussion. Whether it's done as one big indicator summit where we have everybody and then we get divided up into the breakout groups, you know, social, environmental, and then come back together, or, you know, throughout the next 2 months, the Economic Development Committee, the the social health and housing committee have their indicator discussion, and then as those things start coalescing, bring it together. I don't know what's the best way forward, but I support more in-depth charrette around this.
Mr. Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think if you just want to leave the recommendation that you have there and staff have heard the discussion, we'll go away and work on it. I mean, there's some logistics there where we have task forces that are actually, their mandates are ending, so we don't really have the same kind of sounding board, but maybe there's an opportunity to bring reps from those groups. I think it's something to go away and think about, and I certainly hear the interest in this, and I think pulling all those parties together, but if you want to give us that, we understand it, we'll go away and work on setting it up.
Okay, so do you need a motion in one regard or no?
I think the motion you had crafted there, you just dropped the word environment committee, I think works fine for us.
So I'll read it again, and if someone wants to move it, then we can go from there. That a charrette be scheduled to help refine indicators for use in developing the city portrait for Nanaimo as part of the Reimagine Nanaimo process.
Thank you, Chair, and I don't think you can see me on the screen, but I just want to clarify that this would be a recommendation to council, so it will go forward to a council member.
Correct.
And then council will direct staff. Thank you.
Correct, yeah. So I thought Elise move it. Is there, so Elise moves, seconded by Ben. Any discussion? Further discussion? Okay, seeing none, call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries unanimously. So is there any other items that anyone wants to bring up on this topic?
Chair?
Yes.
Just as a follow-up on that, I think it would be good to assign committee members homework to go do an indicator dive in your respective organizations, or checking out other jurisdictions, other municipalities, looking at what's needed here, and find examples and ideas around indicators to come well-informed to any future discussions, so that we can have a robust look at this and provide some ideas and brainstorm with staff.
Thanks, Ben. See some nodding heads there, so I think everyone has received their homework. I think it's a great suggestion, and will be useful as we move forward. Okay, so Elise.
Just to better orient the group, can we put a timeline on when we have to have found our selective indicators to bring back to the committee?
I think we'll give staff a bit of opportunity to unpack some of this discussion, and I think they have a pretty clear understanding. And then once they've mapped the path forward, I would just ask Lisa, Rob, Dale, everybody on here, if you could just sort of let us know on some potential timelines so people can, we won't hold you to it, things change, but we can at least sort of structure our research and our independent ways in which we seek information, and whether we're crammers or do it all up front, people have an idea. So good suggestions.
We'll give you your deadlines, yeah?
Yes.
Is it?
Speak to the professors in the group. Okay, no other business. So if there is none, there would just be a motion to adjourn. Moved by Jerome, and a seconder. All right, all those in favor? Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate the discussion. It was good.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, John, for joining.
You don't have to chime in, John. Done.
Don's okay, he's just...
You guys did a fine job there.
We love you, Don.
Sort of like in the beginning, your birthday circles back.
Goodbye.
Yeah.
Yeah, they did. They went through